What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today I want to take a look at the cards that Wizards of the Coast have spoiled as part of the first look for Wilds of Eldraine. Now, for the purposes of this particular episode of the podcast, I want to just look at the main set Wilds of Eldraine cards that they spoiled. They did show off a bonus sheet that is going to be all enchantments, which is very interesting, and I might do another episode on that separately, or at least some of the individual callouts there. It looks cool. I'm glad they're doing it, although I don't know if it's going to be good for the limited environment. Anyway, more to come on that later. But Wilds of Eldraine itself, they have shown off a number of cards and given us some information on what is to come. And I'm not gonna bury the lead. I'm gonna start with the mythic that has just Twitter, or X, or whatever the heck we're calling it now, a buzz, as I'm sure other social media platforms as well, absolutely exploding. Moonshaker Cavalry. This thing is a house. So what is it? It is a 6/6 Spirit Knight for 5 white, with flying. When Moonshaker Cavalry enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. If that sounds familiar, it is because it is very similar to Craterhoof Behemoth, which is easily, bar none, no exaggeration, the strongest overrun they have ever printed. I feel justified in saying it that way and speaking in absolutes in this case. Craterhoof Behemoth, by giving the entire team trample and +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control, it allows a board state that may be lethal or close to be lethal to be like massive overkill. And as a result, it has become one of the primary finishers in Commander for go-wide strategies because it's just the best in class. You know, there are other overrun style effects that can very, very easily close out a game, but that one does it just better than anybody else. And it's a creature, so it can be reanimated and blinked and all that fun, happy stuff. And Moonshaker Cavalry is all of those things. It gives the team evasion, in this case flying, and it gives the +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. So if you have 10 1/1s, well, no, now they're 11 1/1s, or 12, because it would count the Moonshaker Cavalry itself. So all of a sudden, you know, it would be like, they'd be 12 12s all of a sudden, and now they're flying. In most scenarios, if you're going wide, this card hitting the battlefield means you're dead. Period. It's over. And like this kind of no-nonsense finisher in that kind of a strategy, it is important. They definitely need them. Like, but honestly, like I play a lot of casual Commander, and when Craterhoof ends it, I find myself a little disappointed because it does so cleanly and so effortlessly that I don't know, I've seen it enough times now, and it's not necessarily inspiring, you know? Which not every game has to be, and that's okay. But now we get it again. And so if you're running any kind of token strategy in Selesnya, you now have 2 of them. You can get Moonshaker Cavalry and Craterhoof. And so whichever one you draw into, you just rip that and call it good. So I don't know. It's one of those things where it's an overrun. If you're looking for a big overrun, this is great. Now, it has some downsides. Now, Craterhoof Behemoth gives trample, meaning that the gigantic size of your army is meaningful because your opponent's toughness is what dictates how much damage they can, soak up. Whereas with this, the creatures are now massive and they're flying, but if your opponent has flying blockers, all of a sudden they can chump block these. That's the thing. Craterhoof, there's no chump blocking. It doesn't exist. Everything has trample. Deal with it. And additionally, Craterhoof has haste. Craterhoof itself joins the party. Now, its base stats are only 5/5, which for an 8-drop is pretty lousy, but obviously on the attack, it's bigger than a 5/5. You know, the one turn, which is usually the last turn of the game, it's way bigger than that. And so in this case, Moonshaker Cavalry being a 6/6 as compared to the 5/5 is relevant, and it natively having flying is also relevant. So at the end of the day, Moonshaker Cavalry drops. Your attack becomes significantly stronger, but if your opponent has chump blockers in the air, then all of a sudden, they may be able to mitigate enough damage to survive, in which case, your creatures are going to be powered down, and you're left with a 6/6. Granted, they're probably going to be devastated, because anything they block with is going to get killed pretty comfortably most of the time. Obviously, this kind of effect can also be completely mitigated by fog effects, which, but to be to be honest, that's always been the case. You know, your Spore Frogs, your Kami of False Hopes, your Fog Banks, all that jazz. Still does. Is Fog Bank the one I'm thinking of? Anyway, there are a lot of different good old fashioned fog. There are a lot of fog effects that are very, very strong, and honestly, I don't think enough people are running them. The One Ring also completely shuts this down. So there are a lot of ways to answer this. It is not a silver bullet that's going to win you a ton of games, but if your go wide token strategy needs a finisher, this is going to do a great job. That's really the bottom line. Like, the fact that every discussion around it compares it to Craterhoof, which is already the best overrun ever. Like, the fact that it invites that comparison, it's good. That's it. I have an Orzhov token deck that uses mites. If I can get my hands on this, it's going in there immediately. Yeah, so Moonshaker Cavalry, pretty good. Next up, I want to talk about Ashiok, Wicked Manipulator. So this is the only planeswalker that is going to be appearing in Wilds of Eldraine. Wizards did confirm that, and as they've stated, because of the desparkening, which I know is probably not the word for that, but with the spark rupture that occurred during the March of the Machine aftermath, or during March of the Machine, for some reason, a whole bunch of planeswalkers lost their spark. And so as a result, there's going to be less emphasis on the planeswalker card type moving forward, but they still exist. And so they said we're going to get one in each set moving forward. Cool, at least for a while. Who knows how long that's going to stay, but for now, this is what we got. And I'm cool with that. I think planeswalkers are very, very powerful, and they're very, very splashy. I feel like they've become a little too ubiquitous, so Wizards dialing that back, I'm cool with. I'm very cool with that. And so as a result, like, in the future, doing full-on Super Friends, especially in Standard, like next year after the rotation and things like that, might become a little more challenging, which I think is cool. So anyway, we have Ashiok, Wicked Manipulator. This is a 3 black legendary planeswalker Ashiok with 5 starting loyalty. And they have a passive. If you would pay life while your library has at least that many cards in it, exile that many cards from the top of your library instead. +1, look at the top 2 cards of your library, exile one of them, and put the other into your hand. -2, create 2 1/1 black nightmare creature tokens with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if a card was put into exile this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. -7, target player exiles the top X cards of their library, where X is the total mana value of cards you own in exile. So that ultimate is not hard to get to. Honestly, it's just not. The fact that, -7, starting loyalty of 5 with a +1 ability, you uptick Ashiok for 2 turns, and the -7 is online. And the +1 does exile a card. It puts 1 card into exile. And then the -2, obviously, it helps. The -2 helps protect Ashiok. I guess this is one of my favorite, like, Planeswalker templates. This is about right. This is just a clean Planeswalker design. It's a 5-drop, so it's a little pricey to get on board. The +1 draws you a card effectively and puts a card into exile, which leverages Ashiok's various abilities. The -7, if you set it up correctly, can win the game on the spot. If you have 30 or 40 mana worth of cards in exile for any reason, by the way, it's not just cards exiled with Ashiok, but if you have stuff in exile, that -7 is just going to blast your opponent's library and just get the whole thing gone. And so it has the potential to win the game on the spot if you support it. But if you're casting Ashiok out onto an empty board and you need to protect Ashiok, you need to go -2 first, which knocks the loyalty down to 3. And so all of a sudden, reaching that ultimate becomes much more difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. We also have Proliferate and whatnot in Standard right now, so you could leverage that to good effect. Honestly, this design is really, really clean, and I like it a lot because Ashiok, operating as kind of this ethereal, like, threat that lives within people's dreams. I guess I never really appreciated, but Ashiok is kind of like Magic's Freddy Krueger. And I'm cool with that. And what Ashiok is doing here is operating in the exile zone. So it's not the graveyard. We're not worried about the realm of zombies and or even resurrection if you're in, like, white. You don't get that. that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the unconscious, the realm of dreams, these outside, we're operating in a space and time that is outside matter and existence. And so that being represented in the exile zone kind of makes sense and it helps kind of add to this otherworldly element of Ashiok, which I think is just really neat. And the passive also helps fuel this in a very real way. If you have, say, the Defilers or something like that, or any Phyrexian mana cost of any kind, that is paying life, and that helps you exile cards. Other great ways to exile cards include various like red impulsive draw effects. You have the invasion of Kaldheim. You have Ren's Resolve. You have Reckless Impulse. These cards that put cards into exile. Well, if you don't play them, they stay in exile, and so as a result, them staying in exile means that Ashiok counts them. The other thing is, so it actually kind of mitigates some of the feels bad with those cards. Because like with the cards like Reckless Impulse or Ren's Resolve, one of the problems, especially if you rip it like right on turn 2, is hitting a 4 or 5 drop that you literally cannot cast, and then that card is gone forever. That feels bad. It's really unfortunate when things like that happen, and which is why you don't see those cards in decks that have high casting cost spells generally, or like often, I should say. Not never, but it's not super common. Well, all of a sudden with Ashiok, that doesn't feel bad. Like if I rip a Ren's Resolve, if I pay 2 and I exile 2 cards, and let's say I exile 2 5-drops that I can't cast, well, all of a sudden Ashiok's -7 is now gonna just got an extra boost by 10 cards. Like that's an extra 10 cards that I'm gonna exile from my opponent. That's gonna supercharge that ult if I can get to it. That's freaking sweet. Yeah, I really like that. And the fact that the life gain, the paying life thing. The other thing that's really cool about it is it's not in addition, it's instead. So if you're paying life to get an effect, you don't lose your life in this case. You simply exile cards off your library. But it's designed in such a way that if you've milled aggressively or been milled aggressively and your library is low, you will pay the life instead. If you don't have enough cards, like if you have an effect that says pay 3 life to do a thing, if you don't have 3 cards in your deck, then Ashiok does not replace the effect. You instead would lose 3 life. I like that. The fact that it has that safety valve so that you won't mill out just because of Ashiok's passive is nice. In short, I think this card's great. I'm going to have a lot of fun building around it. This is going to be one of those that when Wilds comes out, I'm probably going to be building around this one very early. So come find me on Twitch, twitch.tv/hammox42 to see this in action, because I think this card's going to be dope. But yeah, we're going to be doing things with like Crocs and Humorous because that exiles cards out of the graveyard. Things are going to be fun. We're going to do good stuff with this. Anyway, next up, we have Talion, the Kindly Lord. This is a Fairy Noble. This is a 3/4 for 2 blue black with flying. As Talion the Kindly Lord enters the battlefield, choose a number between 1 and 10. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value, power, or toughness equal to the chosen number, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. This is kind of bananas, if I'm honest, because if you know your opponent's deck and you know the spells that you're most concerned about or the spells that are most likely to happen, then all of a sudden, this is something that this card can really hose them. I'm thinking of like an Izzet Spell Slinger, like an Izzet Phoenix kind of deck. If you drop Talion and name 1, all of a sudden every Consider, every Opt, every Unholy Heat, all of those, granted Unholy Heat would take out Talion, but all of those would trigger Talion, and the opponent would get domed for 2 and you would draw a card every time they did one of those things for as long as Talion was on the board. That is nuts. Also, if you name... Like if you're going up against an aggro opponent, you could name 1 or 2 because a lot of the time, humans or the red aggro decks with I'm trying to think of in the current red deck in standard. If you named 1, Monastery Swift Spirit would trigger this. Kumano Face's Kakazan would trigger this. Phoenix Chick would trigger this. Feldon doesn't, Squee doesn't, but like most other cards in the entire deck do, which is kind of bananas. Honestly, I'm going to be naming 1 through 3 most of the time with this, unless I am positive my opponent is about to drop a Sheoldred and I want to punish. And I want to punish him for it. Now, in that case, if the opponent casts a Sheoldred and I've named 4 on Talion, the Sheoldred the Apocalypse that is, what will happen is Sheoldred is still on the stack when Talion triggers, And so the opponent would lose the life, and I would draw the card before Sheoldred's online. Be aware of that. So Sheoldred wouldn't get the trigger in that case. But all in all, like, I think this card is actually really cool, and it might have some place in sideboards. If like Spellslinger style decks or like super fast aggro decks, although super fast aggro decks, this is a 4-drop. But it is a 3/4 flyer, so it can block pretty comfortably. And it doesn't die to Lightning Strike. That is very real. Very notable. I don't know. In general, I think this card is really cool. This is one of those where time is going to tell just how good it is. But it looks like this card is going to reward the players who know the meta very, very, very well. If you can identify, what spells are likely to come up. I mean, honestly, I'm probably going to name one most of the time here based on the stuff that's going on right now. In standard, I don't know, but it's gonna be one to 3 is where I think the sweet spot is. Anyway, I like this card a lot, to the point where I'm already thinking about how I'm gonna work it against my opponent, and how well it lines up against certain threats. Yeah, no, I think this is really neat. And drawing cards, it's a card draw engine if you can predict your opponent's actions and your opponent's play. I think this is really cool. Honestly, just bottom line, Talion the Kindly Lord, I dig it. All right, next up. We have Cruel Somnophage, which is a goofy name, but I'm here for it. It is a creature nightmare for 1 and a black, but wait, there's more. It goes on adventures. So Wizards has confirmed that adventures are coming back. And we know in this case, and I believe they confirmed that I think in the panel, they said every adventure within the set is going to follow this pattern. Whereas the adventure, the sorcery in this case, but the spell that is tied to the creature is a different color from the creature. So in this case, Cruel Somnophage is 1 in a black. Meanwhile, Can't Wake Up, the sorcery tied to it, is 1 in a blue. So this is a Dimir card, but you could run it in a mono blue or a mono black deck. But just know if you're running it in those style or in a monocolored deck, you just simply will not have access to the other color unless you find yourself with a treasure token or something of that nature. So be aware of that. But in the case of Cruel Somnophage, so is this card any good? Let's find out. The sorcery, Can't Wake Up, for 1 in a blue. Target player mills 4 cards. Now, this being sorcery speed is not amazing, but it is what it is. We saw with Merfolk Secret Keeper in the Throne of Eldraine set, we saw a similar effect where there was a sorcery for 1 in that case. Target player mills 4 cards. It was significantly better, obviously. 1 is better than 2 when it comes to your mana cost. And so, like, I don't know, that spell doesn't really have me particularly impressed. I don't love it. So, what's the creature? It is a star. Cruel Somnophage's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards. So, this is an interesting setup, interesting design. It has the traditional Lurgoyf style effect. Except the power and toughness are symmetrical, but whatever the case may be. So, this, honestly, like, this card is interesting if a Sultai, creature-heavy, self-mill kind of deck exists. If we can make that deck work in Standard, this card becomes a very powerful addition to it. Because, don't forget, right now, with Standard not rotating, we have old Stickfingers, we have old Rutstein, we have all the mill creatures from Dominaria United, the Branchwood Prowlers and whatnot. But then we also have Urborg Lurgoyf. So Stickfingers, Urborg Lurgoyf, and now Cruel Somnophage all care about the number of creatures in graveyards, except Somnophage also cares about the creature is in your opponent's graveyard. So we're at a point right now where a single deck in Standard can have 12 copies of this type of effect. Well, if the rest of your deck is creatures and you are milling aggressively, these creatures could become massive. Now, removal in Standard is also on a whole other level. It is amazing, and as a result, and like the removal, the single target removal, and the sweepers are both just next level phenomenal. And so as a result, I don't expect creature type strategies like this to work. However, this is supporting graveyard recursion, graveyard filling in a really interesting way. So yeah, Stickfingers, Urborg Lurgoyf, and now Cruel Somnophage. That archetype seems to be getting support. This is interesting. Not to mention Priest of Multiverse could do some really silly things in that setup as well. So I'm definitely going to tinker with this, and we're going to see if we can make it work, because I think this is great. The other cool thing about this is cards like Patch Up that can reanimate small things, or Recommission, which can reanimate small things, can hit this out of your graveyard. So if you have a Cruel Somnophage in your graveyard, assuming that the graveyard is loaded because you've been milling quite a bit, for 2, you can reconfigure this, and it could enter the battlefield as like a 9/9, 10/10, you know, depending on how big your yard is. That's worth 2 mana. Oh my goodness, are you kidding? So, I don't know, there are some cool implications and some cool uses for this. I like this card, and I'm glad that this archetype is going to get support. Additionally, this is an example of a narrow adventure that is not on its face broken. A lot of people say that the adventure mechanic is cracked in half and it's impossible to make balanced adventures. I disagree, and I think this is a great example of what a balanced and fair adventure looks like. It helps fuel itself, you get some utility out of it, but it's narrow and it's slightly overcosted for what you get. Because that is true. The Can't Wake Up sorcery is if that was just a single card, it is a common that I'm going to write off every time and never, ever, ever touch. For 2 mana, sorcery speed, mill 4 cards, no thank you. That's just genuinely awful. But when it comes attached to the creature and you can get both in a game, now we're talking. So, yeah, so that's Cruel Somnophage. Pretty solid. And there's one more I want to talk about today before we call it a day on the podcast, and that is the Restless Fortress. So this is a tapped land, enters the battlefield tapped, and it produces white or black. And it has the ability 2 white, black. Restless Fortress becomes a 1/4 white and black nightmare creature. Until end of turn, it's still a land. Whenever Restless Fortress attacks, defending player loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. So this is a creature land. We've seen these before. We will no doubt see them again, and we're going to see a cycle of them here in Eldraine. Creature lands are interesting. They represent a resource that is difficult to interact with because any removal has to be done at instant speed. Sorcery speed sweepers and the like, just don't touch them. And that's huge. You know, so any kind of planeswalker style removal, traditional like enchantment removal, like your banishing lights and whatnot, just can't touch them. Also, there are plenty of cards that say like destroy all non-land permanents, or you know, like target non-land permanent, or exile target non-land permanent, those kind of things. These never stop being lands, and so as a result, those just completely avoid them. So we're gonna see these, and honestly, they're probably gonna be like the kind of thing that you would throw 1 or 2 of in most of your decks as an outside way to win a game, because that's ultimately what creature lands are. They're not often plan A, although there are some control decks that absolutely use, you know, things like Hollow the Storm Giant as their finisher. So you can do that, but for the most part, if you're playing an aggressive deck and you have these in your mana base, now the fact that these enter tapped goes against the aggressive deck general strategy, because it's going to slow down you mobilizing your threats, which is not ideal. However, if your opponent sweeps the board, but you've softened them up, if your opponent is at 3, they hit a Sunfall or something, or a Depopulate, or whatever the case may be. On your turn, if you activate Restless Fortress and attack, they lose 2, you gain 2 on the attack, and then if they can't block the 1, boom, they're done. That's really cool. I also love that this has a drain on the attack. So even if you're not going to, even if the Restless Fortress itself is going to get blocked, you can still hit your opponent effectively. You still get the drain. That's great. That being on the attack is a big deal, like a shockingly big deal. Also, I want to point out, if you're in Mardu and you have Ishin, Ishin of the Two Heavens in your deck, that's an attack trigger. You would get that twice. So if Ishin is online and Restless Fortress attacks, you would drain them for 4 and you would gain 4. That's a lot. That's a lot. Additionally, the Restless Fortress, it's only 1 power, but it's 4 toughness. And so as a result, this thing's probably going to get chump blocked a lot. But your opponent is not as often going to be able to block it and kill it, because 4 toughness, that's a tall order. You know, late in the game, obviously there are plenty of situations in which it's absolutely going to bite it if you were to attack. But all the same, I feel like that's meaningful. That's pretty cool. I like this. Honestly, I like this this card quite a bit, and I'm very interested to see what the other lands are. I don't love the creature lands existing in Standard. However, we have a ton of options to deal with lands right now. Field of Ruin is a card that you don't see as often these days, but I have a feeling it'll probably come back into fashion with with Wilds of Eldraine, now that we have what appear to be competitive creature lands. So that's going to be a thing. But also Besides Who Endures can hit lands. And so any green players out there, that's a clean answer that can help get rid of things like this. So I'm intrigued by it. I think we're in a position where I feel like Wizards has done a good job of creating answers to lands that don't necessarily feel just like Stone Rain. The 3 mana, you're just down a land now, feels really awful. But I feel like they hit the sweet spot with your Fields of Ruin and your Demolition Field, where it's like, yes, I'm going to blow up your lands, but you can go get a basic and put it in. So moral of the story, run more basics, because you're probably going to see more land hate after Wilds hit Standard. Be aware of that. But anyway, this is good stuff. Also, in Commander, I can see wanting to run these, because they are dual lands. They fix your mana, and they can be creatures to help eke out those last few points in the late game to finish it off. And your opponents will likely underestimate these or just forget about them until it's too late. And that ain't bad. Anyway, thank you so much for checking out this episode of the Overthinking MTG podcast. All in all, I gotta say, Wilds of Eldraine looks like fun, and I'm very excited to see what other stuff we see come down the pipeline, because it looks like it's going to have an impact on Standard. And honestly, that's what I want. And that wasn't a given, because the rotation isn't going to be happening. And so these cards have to compete with a very well-established and a very strong Standard. And I gotta say, I have hope, given what we've seen so far. So thank you so much for checking this out. Appreciate it. If you're watching on the YouTubes, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on your favorite podcast app of choice, please follow, leave a 5-star review. It would help tremendously. So thank you so much. I'll catch you on the next one.